Hello and welcome to Nutrition Unfiltered, a podcast where science meets sass. I am Christy Maloney, registered dietitian and eating disorder specialist. This is a place where we talk nutrition, ask the hard questions, and have some fun along the way. I'm so glad you're here. Hello and welcome back to Nutrition Unfiltered. I'm so happy to be here for the third episode. And today I have joining me Elaine. So Elaine, I'm going to let you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how we know each other.
Hello, it's so good to see you. My name is Elaine. As you said, I am graduating in about a week with a degree in furniture design. And I live in the Appalachian Mountains. And I met you, I think, 6 years ago now, I think.
That sounds right. It's crazy.
Ridiculous. So we met because I was looking for a dietitian to be a part of my outpatient treatment team for my eating disorder. So I was in high school and I had a therapist at the time, and somehow we found you, and I'm so grateful we did. We've been seeing each other ever since. I think I might be one of your oldest clients.
You are definitely one of the oldest ones, for sure. But it's, of course, been a pleasure working with you all of these years and seeing you go through college and seeing how you've transformed in recovery. And it's been really rewarding, for sure.
Oh, it's so good. Yes, I'm so grateful for having found you when I did. And yes, still... our sessions have definitely shifted over time, but I always look forward to them. So
perfect. Well, the goal here, Elaine, is we want to talk about, just for somebody who maybe doesn't understand what it's like to have an eating disorder, what it's like to go through treatment, maybe even helping people that are support persons of someone that's going through an eating disorder and treatment recovery, what that's like. So I'm going to ask if you will just kind of share a little bit of your history of your eating disorder and just what it's been like for you, how the actual experience of having an eating disorder has been.
Yeah, absolutely. So I developed anorexia when I was around late 12, early 13-year-old. So I was definitely a kid. And it was one of those things that I personally believe just came out of a genetic predisposition. I was never someone who was overly conscious of my body or overly conscious of my food choices. And I also think that, I grew up in a household that was extremely food positive. My mom is a dietitian, and she's not a, pro-diet dietitian. She's a very kind of health at every size minded person. So I think that I was just, I was born to, at some point, probably struggle with this. So I was a kid and I developed an eating disorder, but I think when you're age and you're a very, quote unquote, functional kid, I was a very social person. I was doing well in school. I think that the people around me didn't really view what I was doing as an issue because I was also extremely good at hiding it or making it not very visible to the people I loved. I think, as a protective mechanism, just to, I didn't want anyone to shut it down necessarily at the time. I just didn't really know what was going on. So I went relatively untreated, completely untreated professionally for many years. That was in 8th grade, and I had an eating disorder all throughout high school before I actually sought treatment. And I think seeking treatment kind of just came from more of the physical implications of having an eating disorder for that long. But in terms of the actual experience of having an eating disorder, I was thinking about this the other day when, trying to prepare for this. And I think it's hard to say anything that's, black and white or having an eating disorder was this one way, because it's kind of full of dichotomies. In one way, it's all consuming, and it kind of took over pretty much every aspect of my life. But then at the same time, I was able to sustain it while, thriving in school, while having a really good social life, while, from the outside appearing very, functional and having having good relationships. There's both sides to that. And then, you know, I think I could just say like it was a super hard thing. And it was in a lot of ways. Like it's a really hard experience, but it's also when you have an eating disorder, it's the easiest thing for you to do. Like recovery is a much harder option there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that when I think about like I can't just put it in one box. Like it kind of rides the line on all these things. You know, it's something that I wish I never had in some ways, and then in other ways I'm like really grateful that it has transformed kind of my perspective on the world and on bodies and on how we interact with ourselves. So, you know, I think it's a complex experience.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that the things that you're grateful for about your eating disorder, because I feel like, a lot of people wouldn't understand that, right? So when you think about maybe the positives that have come out of transforming your worldview, your relationship with bodies, that kind of stuff, how would you describe that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I do want to preface it in the sense of like, I don't always love the thought of like, oh, we're blessed by the things we go through because we are in some capacities, but also like, you know, traumas to our bodies and to our emotional experiences are really hard. But I will say, I've talked to you about this. I really believe that I have a much better relationship with food than 95% of the population, even though I still consider myself to be in recovery. Just because so many people who have never been through an eating disorder live their whole lives with guilt and with shame about their bodies, and I mean, I talk to people all the time who have never had an eating disorder who talk about, oh, you know, Thanksgiving's coming up, this is why I'm running X amount of miles, or that, oh, I'm going to skip the meal before. Or they'll just say, I was serving ice cream for this festival this weekend, and I had several people who said, as they had it, oh, this is indulgent, but I never do this. And just feeling like they have to put that into the world because they have that shame with them. And because I've been through this, I'm like, fuck that. Like it's not even indulgent. It's just an experience. Like I know
Mhm.
that life is full of experiences, and some of them are super enjoyable and some of them are not enjoyable, and there's not shame or guilt tied to enjoying experiences. So I think that that's something that I've gained throughout recovery.
Yeah. And I agree with that because if we look at the spectrum of eating from intuitive eating to disordered eating to just like full on diagnosable eating disorders, so many people, like you're saying, live in that disordered space their whole lives. And I agree that you've kind of slid like back down the spectrum toward, more intuitive eating for the most part, which I think is like such a great thing to point out that is a benefit of this.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, when I say like I'm still in recovery, I, in terms of behaviors that I do, I mean, I really still think it's so many fewer behaviors than the average person does. So I think I'm just much more aware of it as well. So yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah,
Our society has an eating disorder of its own, so it's hard to
it
parse
really
that apart.
does. So, I don't want to dwell too much on the harder parts, but if you could give like an overview of what you feel like maybe your eating disorder has taken away from you. And I love the way you described that, outward appearing, you seemed very functional, I think is a really great word. What was going on behind the scenes, right? Like, what was it like internally for you that other people didn't see?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's a really important point, especially because if you see someone like myself who was doing quote unquote well from the outside, yeah, I think it is important to note the hardship with that. I would say that like I really have a lot of grief over the years that I feel like I've lost through my eating disorder. Like, I was a kid, and rather than just experiencing my childhood, I can think of most vacations and remember the exact meals that I was eating on those vacations because they were riddled with so much anxiety around them and compensation and, how am I going to work this into the rest of my day? I also just think, I mean, during the worst of it, I think was when I was a kid and I just didn't know what was happening, and I didn't even think I had an eating disorder for the first few months. And I remember just feeling so isolated and alone, and like just obviously no one knew what I was going through. And I also didn't really understand what I was going through. But yeah, I think that when you have an eating disorder, and especially, I mean, I can't speak for any other eating disorder other than anorexia, but I feel like, I was unable to pursue any other part of myself outside of productivity, becoming smaller, moving more. There were like three things that were ruling my existence. And I think, I'm still on I don't love the word journey, but a journey of, of trying to figure out, what are my hobbies? What are things that I enjoy doing? Because I spent, close to a decade, I'm 23 now, close to a decade consumed by trying to be something that was never authentic to me. So I think that the fact that it just affected my identity so much and my daily experience, I mean, it's a very painful existence to constantly be anxious and constantly be hungry and be thinking about that all the time.
Yeah, and I think, that's something I hear a lot is how it becomes an identity. And I think that that is part of what makes it appear functional. By
Mm.
society standards, if you're eating less and moving more and there's a focus on, eating healthy, quote unquote, society praises that. So while it's one of those most internal, deepest, darkest, hardest struggles, it's also heavily praised, which, right? It's dichotomous, which was the word you used. And I think that's spot on.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky in that I really grew up in a community that I honestly, I really was hardly ever praised for my size or for my quote unquote discipline. I also hate that word in regards to an eating disorder because it's really nothing to do with it. But,
Right.
I was really wasn't praised that much for those things themselves, but I have been praised my whole life for my ability to work really hard and be really committed to a certain thing. And I think that having an eating disorder, especially one that's so restrictive and focused on one quote unquote goal, I think that those go hand in hand. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So let's talk for a minute about treatment, right? Can you kind of go through your treatment history, different levels of care, and what that has been like for you? And especially for, anybody that's listening that maybe, is recently diagnosed with an eating disorder or, a parent or a loved one that has somebody that's about to kind of go through that process. What was it like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I ended up getting treatment, like I said, probably like 4 years after developing an eating disorder. So I think in a lot of ways, treatment felt really validating at first. I think just because I was at that point so ready for life to get better. So it was really great if you can find the right professionals, which obviously you are, and my long term therapist that I don't see anymore but have just so much love for. Both you and her were just, yeah, like such validating forces. But so yeah, I saw you and a therapist at first, which I think would just be called, outpatient treatment. And that was really wonderful. I think a great starting point. And I will say this is a tangent, but finding the right dietitian is extremely good because I went I've told this story before, but the first dietitian I went to essentially said, I'm going to say numbers here, but essentially said that I could, recover slash gain weight on 1,500 calories. So there are people who know
Wow.
what they're talking about and people who don't, and she was not one. So finding the right treatment team. But so yeah, I mean, I saw y'all, and then it was just an issue of I was having some health complications within those few months that had nothing to do with seeing you. It was just that I had had an eating disorder for so long, and it was kind of like past a point of no return at that specific level. So I was having some heart abnormalities and really low temperature and, bone mass loss and all these things that, higher level of care kind of would have been supportive towards. So after a couple months in outpatient, I went to residential treatment, and I ended up only staying there for a month. So for anyone who's not familiar with the structure, the highest level of treatment is inpatient, which is typically a hospital setting. It has access to like tube feeding and all that. And then the level right below that is residential. And then there are two sort of quasi inpatient more means of what's the word, treatment. Thank you. And then after that's outpatient treatment. So I had a month in inpatient treatment, and it was hard. I was very glad I went, and I think it was exactly what I needed at the time, but it was really challenging. And then after that, I went to outpatient treatment back with you, and I've just been with you and my therapist ever since, and then now just seeing you every few weeks.
Yeah. So even when you went to residential, what was that like for you? And you said it was, difficult in a lot of ways. And I think that, a lot of people don't understand what that experience is like. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I would say that if you're ready for it, it is, I mean, seriously, such a privilege and a really good option for people, especially if you can find a place that has been, well reviewed. I mean, I don't even know how these bodies are reviewed or anything, but this was a very seemingly reputable place that I went to. So, I mean, part of me it's kind of a weird experience because you go so long kind of denying the extent of your problem, and then suddenly you're living with a bunch of other people who have the same the same issue, and you're like, damn, I guess
Yeah,
that's
like shit just got real. Yep.
literally, yeah. I mean, and like I said with earlier, that it was very validating in that, like, I had never been around people, a bunch of people who were going through the same exact thing that I was, and we could all talk about it. But I mean, it was challenging because I know I've mentioned the idea of being quote unquote functional, but I will say that I was in a place, I think a lot of the people there went there because certain aspects of their life outside of their eating disorder had started to fall off as a result of their eating disorder. And I didn't really feel like I was in that place. Like I felt like that's just how I think my experience was. And that's might not be typical experience, but it was a little bit odd just because I think part of me created this separation where I was like, wait, no, like I shouldn't be here. All these people are, had to lose their jobs and whatever, which is not at all the case for everybody. But I think that was a healthy thing for me to realize, well, no, you are here and you obviously need to be here. And it doesn't actually really matter what other things are going on in my life. Like that was the level of care that I needed at the time. But I've told this story to you before that, I mean, the day one, they do these like goodbye snacks where people who are leaving do a fancy snack. And it was like a cream filled donut. And then we had a peanut butter and jelly for lunch. And I remember being like, holy fuck. Like, if this is what it's going to be the whole
Shit got
time.
real.
Shit got so real. Yeah, I was like, this is just ridiculous. And obviously, thinking back on that now, I'm like, wow, obviously I've come so far that would not faze me now. But at the
Right.
time, I mean, it's like talk about a crash course into recovery. You just kind of got to dive into it. So.
Yeah, there's definitely a component of radical acceptance there. like,
Sure.
like I'm surrendering to the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I think that's really hard a lot of times for people to step into. But the ability to do that, I don't know if expedites the process is like too harsh or cold, but it really does if you're able to surrender and just kind of say like, yep, we've got a cream filled donut today and this is what we're doing.
Right. No, you're
Yeah,
completely right. And I mean, unfortunately, with the US healthcare system, expediting the process poses its own challenges. I mean, I will
truth.
say I was one of those people who was like, if I'm going to be here, I'm going to do everything to recover. Like, I was just day one was so jarring for me. I mean, you're living in a house that you have to move away from home. Like, this was during the holidays. I wasn't with my family. Like, it sucked. And I was like, I'm going to do everything so that I can move on. But I will say, after 3 weeks of being there and doing what I was supposed to be doing in treatment, my insurance provider said, well, obviously, she's eating her meals. So therefore, you know,
Yeah, it's such
they're
bullshit. It is
right.
such bullshit. Yep.
Yeah, we could talk about that for a very long time.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation for sure. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, the process gets expedited for you in some ways.
Right. Oh,
Hmm.
exactly. I mean, and I will say, I don't want to snore at the fact that, there is a level of privilege that allows for you to uh, be able to have all of those access to all of those options, even when insurance is being like that. So, anyhow.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, access to care is a big deal. It's a really big deal.
Mm.
So throughout the course of like even, going from then over through college, right? Essentially is when you've done the bulk of your recovery work. What has that part been like for you to kind of, go at an outpatient level of care? What's been helpful? What would you consider the parts that were the most difficult? How would you describe
Mm.
that part of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really good in that we've been able to uh, integrate outpatient treatment into my every aspect. I mean, like, I've been in high school, I've been in 5 years of college, and soon to not be in college. So, I mean, the great thing about outpatient, especially now, that telehealth is so convenient, is that, we've been able to keep such a regular schedule throughout. But I would say in terms of like challenges, well, one is that, I mean, I do think that college is a very disordered time of people's lives, like just the college space. There's the whole idea of the freshman 15, and like also just people having to eat on their own for the first time in their life, like not having their parents make meals or whatever. So I think at first, like the some of the challenges have just been like navigating those life shifts and those external triggers, if you want to call them that, and just being able to work with whatever stage of life I'm in at the time. I would say one challenge that I think isn't talked about that much is those like weird intermediary steps. Like, I was on a meal plan with you for a, a little while after residential treatment, but before it was safe for me to not be on one. And using exchanges, which I don't know if you aren't familiar with them, they're just like it's a meal plan that doesn't require you to count calories.
Yeah. Just very
So
neutral
you
food groups.
Right, exactly. But I mean, it is weird being in a dining hall and like taking a picture of my food and saying, "Oh, this is 2 protein and 3 starch," and you know, sending that to you. And
Yes.
like a super valuable thing, but it does make you feel a little bit like, oh, damn, I'm doing something that most people are not having to go through, and that's a challenge.
Yeah. In the moment, were you sitting with people like, I know we use in our practice recovery record a lot for, clients to log, meals, pictures, thoughts about meals, that kind of thing. Were you around other people or was that kind of flying solo?
That's a good question. I think most of the time I was alone. And if not, like, a lot of people, phone eats first type of thing. Or it's like some people might wonder why I'm taking a picture of my baked potato with beans from the dining hall. But, ultimately, I think it's kind of more normal now than it probably
Mhm.
was 10 years ago.
Yeah, true, true. But a testament to commitment to treatment and doing what you needed to get toward recovery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is something I'll say is that I have had my ups and downs. I mean, even within college and definitely within college, post inpatient and stuff. But I always knew the end goal was going to be recovery. So whatever led there, even if it wasn't always linear, I was pretty committed to.
Yeah. When did you notice you were turning the corner? Right. To get from
Hmm.
I'm fully like entrenched in my disorder to, okay, like I can see recovery, right? Like there's a glimmer of that there.
Well, so I mean, I will say that I think a part of me really wanted recovery for a long time, way before I sought treatment. I think I was just in so much, internal pain that like someone finally reaching out to me, I think kind of felt like that, which was that senior year right before I received treatment. I was just like, wow, I actually have this opportunity to potentially recover. So I think the glimmer of hope kind of happened relatively quickly, and it felt quickly because it was like, oh, now that someone has reached out to me, I really do want to commit. But I think that wouldn't have happened so, quickly if I hadn't had years before leading up to that where I had been kind of suffering. So I would say, yeah, like right when I started seeking treatment was when I was like, oh, this really could be the way out. Like I was never treatment resistant in that way. But I will say, like, I went to inpatient treatment, I did outpatient treatment, and for about a year and a half, 2 years, I think I was kind of just like, okay, I'm going to do this to the level that I can maintain and live a pretty good life, but I wasn't actually that invested in improving the quality of my life, beyond that. So, and then I went to, I mean, shows again how nonlinear recovery is. After probably, a year and a half of seeing you, I went abroad. I studied abroad and I relapsed while abroad. And I think after that experience was when I really saw a shift where I realized I was like, I can't just keep relapsing. And I think since then it's been a much more linear trajectory towards like, I actually really want to live a good life and live a sustainable life that can last me a long time.
Yeah. And I think what you described is kind of that quasi recovery. I'm recovered appearing enough to be able to
Mm-hmm.
eat in a variety of situations, eat a variety of foods with minimal to moderate anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
recovered enough. And it sounds like when you went abroad, that then you realized, wow, this eating disorder really stands the chance to disrupt a lot of things in the future, given how quickly that happened for you while you were there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think I wasn't being very like protective of my recovery before then because yeah, I like you said, I was living a very livable life, but I mean that is something that I don't think is talked about that often is that like once you have if you have a history of an eating disorder, you can't just treat yourself like every other person who has not had an eating disorder. I have friends who are able to go for a day and skip a meal. My partner has had a very normal relationship with food, and, sometimes he has a very weird schedule of eating. And that's totally fine for him because, he's never had an eating disorder. For me, if I skip a meal, within the hour of skipping it, my eating disorder brain will turn on and say, oh, we can do X, Y, and Z to continue this trajectory. So, I mean, I think at that point, I was not actually aware of the fact that I can't just treat myself like everybody else who has not had an eating disorder. And I think now I have many more protective mechanisms.
Yeah, right. It truly is. I kind of call that the restricting snowball of there's that one behavior and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that you're right, for someone that is appearing recovered enough, like you said, to miss a meal or do something like that can seem normal appearing, but has a real like propensity to throw someone backward in their recovery. And I love the way you phrase that. I have to be protective of my recovery, which is just a really good sentiment.
Oh yeah, I will say though, I mean it has taken a long time to even want to be protective of my recovery. So I understand and empathize with those who are not at all there, you know.
Right. Yeah, and I think part of that, of course, right, the empathy because you've been there, but hopefully that's offering to others hope. Hope that is there for them. And that's one thing I say to clients all the time is the possibility of recovery exists for you. And
Mm.
I know that is, it's beautiful, right? Like that's a lovely statement, but I think that when you're in the throes of things, like it doesn't feel like that possibility exists. And I think that it's, really important for you to highlight, as you've done, that it does. Even if you don't see it, it's there.
Mm.
So, like, just keep going. I don't know. What would you tell somebody that is in
Oh,
that position where they can't see it? It's not even a possibility. What do you think?
no, yeah, I totally understand that space. And yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the worst things we can say to people with eating disorders is that full recovery is not possible. I mean, I think had I heard that early on in my recovery, I would have just been like, "Fuck this." I'm already at a point where it feels kind of livable. I can go on vacation, I can do all these things and have anorexia. Why don't I just do that the rest of my life if it's not possible? But it totally is. I mean, so there's that aspect of it. But then also I think something to think about is just the fact that like a lot of things just take time and consistency, and unfortunately it is really painful and uncomfortable for a long time before it just like naturally starts to feel better. And I don't necessarily think that you can force yourself to feel really good in your recovery. I just think that other systems might exist in your life to help recovery feel better, and just also like practicing things over and over. I mean, it's just, rewiring your brain slowly that that has led to me not, experiencing anxiety in the same way that I used to, or any of those experiences that used to control me so much. So yeah, I mean, I think that as someone who had, long lasting anorexia that wasn't treated immediately, like the fact that I am where I am now is, I think, quite a hopeful kind of
Yeah,
sentiment. Yeah.
it's a testament to your hard work. And, I think that, what you were describing of, when you first go into treatment, it feels very counterintuitive. If your eating disorder has been a coping mechanism, a way to disconnect from your body or the world or whatever you needed it to disconnect you from, to press into that, I think is the hardest part. And I know that's where a lot of times I see clients kind of say like, "Oh no, this is like way too much." What would you say to somebody there?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that eating disorders serve a different function for everybody. I mean, like you said, it being a coping mechanism for some folks. For me, that never really resonated with me, but I know that that was definitely part of it. But just, the idea of control, the idea of being, what you think of as the best, being a high achiever, being a perfectionist, all of those things are, it makes sense that the eating disorder ties into those. But another thing is that, like, you can be all of those things without an eating disorder. I am still a perfectionist. I don't necessarily love that I'm a perfectionist, but I'm aware of the fact that I can have those qualities and those aspects of myself without having an eating disorder. I can be a high achiever without having an eating disorder. I am in control of my body more so by having a more intuitive relationship with food rather than having an eating disorder. I mean, seriously, having an eating disorder is probably the least in control that you are with your body. It feels very good, but in actuality, you're not responding to your body's signals in any capacity. So, I mean, it's dichotomous in that way. I don't know. I'm sorry. I may not have answered that question too directly, but
No, I think that's
um,
perfect. And that, what you said about feeling in control, but actually being as out of control with your body as you can be, I think is a really important point, because if someone is attempting to control their body through restricting, that leads to a mental out of control, a physical out of control, a complete disconnect that feels really like it doesn't make sense if you're in the middle of that, but it is very, very much out of control. And I think, you touched on being a high achiever. You can be that in your eating disorder and out of your eating disorder. And, I think in a lot of ways you have been in spite of your eating disorder,
Mm,
because there's a lot of chances and there's been a lot of opportunities where your eating disorder really could have taken you down, like out of
mm.
your life and out of school and that kind of thing. And I think that's been a testament to your motivation for recovery and your strong will to just keep going.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I do think that like a lot of us, we all have these qualities that we view as negatives, but also typically are positive qualities. And, I do really think that perfectionism has played a big role in my eating disorder. But you're right, it has played a big role in getting me out of it as well. So, hopefully most people have those qualities that they can use against their eating disorder if they have the ability to.
What would you say that you want others to know that are misconceptions of eating disorders?
Mm.
So for
Mm,
people
you
that just don't get it, what would you say?
Oh, we love talking about this, Christy.
Oh
I will
yeah, it's
say,
one. I love it.
we always get on these nice
One of
little
my
tangents.
favorites.
So I was thinking about these. I would say one thing that I think is often overlooked is that anytime we talk about eating disorders, we're looking at systemic issues. I think that oftentimes we make it seem like it's this thing where, oh, you have a bad relationship with your body or with food, and that's an individual issue. But I mean, we have to look at so many aspects that are systemic. Access to care, we kind of touched on. Who has access to care? Who has the resources? Who lives in the place where there can be good care? I talked about my insurance cutting me off after a certain amount of time. It was the amount of money that thankfully it ended up going through, but I mean, it could make someone go into poverty. So there's that. Also talking about like which bodies in our society are prioritized. And I think we all kind of talk about that in terms of size of bodies, but also like thinking about how colonialism has played its part and racism has played its part in which bodies we view as valuable. And then also as a part of that, like which cultures we view as valuable in that, which food or style of eating is viewed as good and which is not, and how that relates to culture. So yeah, one is that there's all those systemic things that I think need to be addressed in recovery and in eating disorder awareness, because yeah, I don't think that we're going to be able to make any population sized impact if we're just treating individuals. Yeah, that's one big thing. I would say another is just that, like, I mean, I know a lot of things on social media talk about this, but which bodies have eating disorders. I think that, I've said this before, but I actually really do feel privileged that I had anorexia. That sounds like that sounds gross, honestly, to say, but like I have so many friends who have had very severe eating disorders that have not changed their body size, and therefore they were not taken seriously, or it made them they were in a larger body as a result of their eating disorder, and they weren't taken seriously. So that's another thing. Let me think. Gosh, there's so many little things that I'm sure we could
Yeah.
talk about.
No, I think that's, those are two really big ones to point out is how much, we know that there are a lot of factors that go into the development of eating disorders in terms of biological, genetics, psychological, it usually coexists with other mental health disorders, and then social, right? And so that's kind of what you're getting at with the thin ideal, really,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of upholding this very sort of like white Eurocentric model of beauty and how that does play into eating disorders. And again, like we've talked about, there's so many factors that go into the development of the eating disorders. But when we have this beauty ideal that almost all of the population can't live up to, it definitely plays into things. And I think that's really important to note, especially for people that have never been, I don't know if informed is the right word, never kind of seen, the implications of that as they are maybe themselves still entrenched in diet culture and this belief
Mm.
that thin ideal is for everyone. I think that's right. And then, what you were saying about feeling, what was it you said?
Just that different bodies being.
Well, thinking about like the anorexia piece, you said you're privileged. That was the word
Oh yeah,
used to have had anorexia, and I think that that is the one that our society understands. This society, our society understands anorexia, and I do agree with you that there are so many people, for the most part, people that suffer with eating disorders. You would not be able to look at them and tell that they have an eating disorder. And I think it's, we can even look at in the DSM-5 at the bullshit diagnosis of atypical anorexia. Just because your
yes.
BMI is not, what is qualified as low, and I'm using that in quotation marks. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of kind of bullshit stigma around that too. And I think you're spot on in terms of that hindering someone's access to care. It does all the time. We see it all the time, and it's really frustrating.
Oh, I believe it, especially I can imagine as a healthcare provider. I mean, with that, like, not only was I taken seriously just because of the way I looked, but I think that the reason why I was in admitted inpatient so quickly was that, I mean, my body was really suffering the low weight consequences of that. And there are many consequences, health consequences of eating disorders regardless of weight, but I do think that those just physical consequences also aren't taken as seriously. And then you saying that made me just think about how, we do talk about the thin ideal and like which bodies are prioritized and all that, but I guess another misconception with that is that body image is this really sole factor of eating disorders. Because I mean, I think I've said this before, but I am really not someone who has ever cared what people think of how I look. Like you know, I have shaved my head so many times. Lord, anybody who knew me in middle school knew that my style was not trying to follow any trends. I would wear these ridiculous like pattern on tutu on whatever. So I mean, for me, like I the whole idea of like I never resonated with the idea of, oh, you want to be thin so that you can fit this ideal. I think that I developed an eating disorder, and then all of those justifications of an eating disorder kind of fell in place because it maintained my eating disorder. Like once you see, oh, I can have an eating disorder so that I can look this way. As I grew older and was more influenced by society, those continued to like help maintain my eating disorder, but they were never for me starting points. And I think for a lot of people, they're not starting points. There are other, like you said, a multitude of issues that can provoke an eating disorder.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that while body image might not have been one of the initial triggers, becoming a maintaining factor in your eating disorder, I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that now I've achieved this body that society says is the one that's worthwhile. And I sure shit don't want to lose that because that's
Hmm.
scary.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I didn't grow up in a family that reinforced that, but just living in our society and the little comments that you'll get, I mean, I have to say it's kind of crazy how few comments of concern I got over the years. I primarily got comments of, wow, I wish I could be like you in whatever capacity. And so going back to, even if it's not about body image, if you're a high achiever and a perfectionist, and then you get these reinforcements from external forces, yeah, of course it's hard to let that go. And especially, I mean, I will say I'm privileged to have my natural set point in a straight size body. And so for me, I mean, everybody has a different experience with that letting go, because I will say I didn't really have to go through the trauma of having negative comments of my weight at my set point. But a lot of people do. Their healthiest point is a point that society does not view as healthy. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it's hard to let go of that once you're kind of there.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So before we wrap up, I would love to hear the thing that you love the most about recovery. What are you able to do that you feel like in your eating disorder you would have not been able to do?
I love that question. I think that I'm just actually able to live more in accordance to my values. I'm someone who really has strong personal values, and those include, loving people and being loved by people. And it's really hard to feel like that feels authentic when you're living in a way that prioritizes your body size over all other experiences. It's really hard to prioritize others with an eating disorder, and it's obviously really hard to prioritize yourself. And I think just being able to actually live in a way that feels authentic to me and pursue things that, I'm, like I said, I'm graduating with a degree in furniture design. Like, what the hell? That's whack. Like, it's just a weird thing to do. But I mean, I have to say, I started my degree studying dietetics, which, I have a lot of passion towards, but I think it's great that I've been able to pursue something that has nothing to do with my body size or what I'm putting in my body. So yeah, I think that recovery in general I think that probably applies to most people who go into recovery, is that like authenticity is so crucial towards our sense of self. And I think that that's like one of the only things we really have, beyond for ourselves. And so I'm just extremely grateful that I have been able to realize that, like, this is my life and I have to live it in a way that, supports me for the rest of my life and I feel good about. And yeah, so I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to also, yeah, another great thing is that I am alive. Like that's a top number one.
We like that. We like that.
We like that. Yes.
All right, Elaine. Well, thank you so much for being on today. I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot of understanding and insight into eating disorders, treatment, that kind of thing, because of your willingness to share and be vulnerable and, kind of tell about your experience and your story. So thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm so glad you're here.
Christy.
All right, bye.
Thank you. Good to see you. Bye.
Thank you for joining me today on Nutrition Unfiltered. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with others that might enjoy it as well. You can follow me on Instagram at eatingdisorder.dietitian. Thanks for getting sassy with me.